Sign the waiver or you walk out with zero, Brandon sneered, sliding a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany desk. I picked up my silver Mont Blanc pen, wrote a single sentence at the bottom of page 14, revoking my Class B voting proxy, and walked out into the driving autumn rain. 72 hours later, their $350 million buyout credit facility collapsed, pulling down a $1.2 billion takeover deal with it. To understand why a single sentence from a 49-year-old corporate strategist could dismantle an 18-year enterprise, you have to go back to 2008. I joined Thornton Capital Partners when it was nothing more than a mid-tier private equity firm operating out of a leased suite on the 12th floor of a Midtown Manhattan tower. The founder, Gerald Thornton, was 58 at the time, sharp as a razor, and desperate for structural capital. I was 31, equipped with a law degree, an accounting background, and 8 years of ruthless cross-border merger experience. Over the next 18 years, I structured every major asset acquisition for Thornton Capital. I negotiated leveraged buyouts, drafted complex debt syndication covenants, and managed portfolio restructuring. My greatest achievement came in 2012 when we acquired Zenith Logistics, a struggling regional freight line valued at $35 million. Over 14 years, I transformed Zenith into an automated supply chain giant, generating $250 million in annual EBITDA. When we reorganized the entity under Delaware General Corporation law, I did not settle for simple common equity or standard stock options. I knew how founders behaved when money got large. Instead, I structured my executive compensation package through an offshore holding trust called Veto Capital LLC. I took 5% of Zenith Logistics in Class B special preferred voting stock. These Class B shares carried a crucial protective covenant under Delaware Statute, Section 242. They granted Veto Capital LLC explicit class voting veto rights over any structural debt reorganization exceeding $100 million, as well as any charter amendment altering equity conversion ratios. Gerald Thornton signed the original charter documents in 2012 without reading the fine print of Schedule 4C. Assuming it was a standard institutional anti-dilution clause designed to protect senior debt providers. For 14 years, those shares sat quietly in my personal vault, overlooked by corporate auditors and forgotten by executive leadership. By early 2026, Zenith Logistics was prime target material. Apex International, a global tech infrastructure conglomerate, approached us with an all-cash acquisition offer valuing Zenith at $1.2 billion. The transaction relied on a 4.8 multiplier on EBITDA. To complete the transaction, Thornton Holdings needed to execute a complex equity recapitalization, rolling over existing debt into a new $350 million senior leveraged buyout facility underwritten by a syndicate led by J.P. Morgan. That was when the culture inside Thornton Capital shifted. Gerald Thornton had grown tired of active oversight. He spent 6 months of the year in St. Barthélemy, leaving daily operations to his 34-year-old nephew, Brandon Thornton. Brandon was a business school graduate whose primary credential was carrying his uncle's last name. He arrived at the firm with an expensive suit, an unearned executive title of senior managing director, and an aggressive obsession with stripping equity from long-term partners. Brandon viewed my 18-year tenure not as foundational expertise, but as an expensive liability. He saw my 5% Class B stake as an obstacle to his personal compensation pool. Under the proposed Apex takeover, my equity was scheduled to yield $85 million upon closing. Brandon wanted that money added to his family's payout pool. 3 months before the scheduled closing date, Brandon began reorganizing the deal structure behind closed doors. He brought in his own external legal counsel and started revising the corporate court charter amendments required by the bank syndicate. He assumed that because I was an employee sitting in an office down the hall, I would sign whatever authorization documents were placed on my desk during the final closing rush. He did not realize that, in corporate mergers, authority does not come from executive titles or corner offices. Authority belongs to whoever holds the structural legal covenants. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, I reviewed the SEC disclosures and debt registry filings from my office. I watched Brandon's legal team make subtle changes to the debt covenants, attempting to reclassify Class B preferred equity into non-voting common shares. I said nothing. I let them assemble the transaction books. I let them submit the debt applications to the banking syndicate. I let them set the formal closing date for October 15th. The trap was not something I built overnight. It was a structural web Gerald and Brandon built around themselves through greed, incompetence, and absolute arrogance. On October 10th, 5 days before closing, Brandon summoned me to the main executive boardroom. The room featured floor-to-ceiling views of Manhattan, a 20-foot mahogany table, and three of the firm's outside corporate attorneys sitting silently along the wall. Gerald Thornton joined via video link from his yacht in the Bahamas, his face displayed on the high-definition monitor at the head of the room. Brandon did not offer me a seat. He stood at the head of the table, holding a black leather binder containing the final restructuring agreement. Nathan. Brandon started adjusting his gold cufflinks with a smirk. We are finalizing the closing documents for the Apex acquisition. As part of the institutional debt package, the bank syndicate requires a full equity consolidation. We need all minor class shareholders to sign an unconditional equity dilution waiver and assign their voting rights back to Thornton Holdings. He opened the binder and pushed a single signature page across the mahogany table toward me. Attached to it was a check for $250,000. This is a severance and advisory payout. Brandon continued smoothly. Your position as Senior Director of Corporate Restructuring is being eliminated effective immediately. You will sign the waiver, hand over your company laptop, and vacate the building by 5 o'clock today. I looked at the document on the table, then looked up at the video monitor displaying Gerald Thornton's face. Gerald, I said calmly, you signed the 2012 corporate charter. You know Class B shares carry mandatory class voting approval for debt facilities over $100 million under Delaware law. You cannot consolidate equity without Vein Capital's explicit consent. Gerald chuckled on the speakerphone, waving a hand dismissively. Nathan, don't be difficult. You've been well compensated over the years. Brandon is running the firm now. We need a clean capital structure for Apex. Sign the papers and take the severance. Don't ruin 18 years of goodwill. Brandon leaned over the table, his smile disappearing. Let me be clear, Nathan. If you refuse to sign this waiver, we will deem you in breach of fiduciary duty. We will cancel your unvested options, void your equity under the executive employment agreement, and escort you out with security. You walk away with nothing. I looked down at the signature page. I saw the arrogance in Brandon's eyes, the casual betrayal in Gerald's voice, and the quiet satisfaction of attorneys who thought they had executed a perfect corporate squeeze. I picked up my pen. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, raise an arm, or demand a higher severance check. In 18 years of corporate restructuring, I had learned that emotional outbursts in a boardroom are the weapon of people who have already lost. True legal power is executed quietly, on paper, with unambiguous terms. I uncapped my silver Montblanc pen. Instead of signing on the designated line for the equity waiver, I flipped the document to page 14, right beneath the section titled Special Shareholder Authorizations. In clear, precise handwriting, I wrote 4 lines across the blank legal margin. Vein Capital LLC hereby formally revokes all historical voting proxies assigned to Thornton Holdings, pursuant to Delaware General Corporation Law. Section 242, subsection B, paragraph 2, Vein Capital LLC explicitly withholds consent for the $350 million senior debt recapitalization and any associated charter amendments. Below those 4 lines, I signed my name as Managing Director of Vein Capital LLC, dated it October 10, 2026, at 4:15 in the afternoon, and slid the paper back across the mahogany table. Brandon picked up the document, glanced at my handwritten paragraph, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He did not bother reading the statutory citation. He did not ask his outside counsel to examine the margin. To a 34-year-old executive accustomed to getting his way through corporate bluffing, handwritten notes on a corporate document were nothing more than a childish gesture of frustration. Very mature, Nathan, Brandon sneered, tossing the paper into his leather briefcase. You think writing scribbles on a contract changes anything? Your employment contract had an automatic power of attorney clause. The board can sign on your behalf anyway. You just forfeited your $250,000 severance package. Security will accompany you to your office. Two uniformed building security guards stepped inside the boardroom doorway. Gerald Thornton's face on the video monitor shook his head in feigned disappointment. "Good luck finding another senior advisory role in Manhattan at your age, Nathan," Gerald said cold-heartedly, his voice crackling over the Bahamas satellite link. "You should have taken the check." "Thank you for your guidance over the years, Gerald," I replied evenly, adjusting my navy blue suit jacket. "I wish you both the best of luck with the bank syndicate on Monday." I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The security guards followed me down the carpeted hallway to my corner office on the 11th floor. My assistant, a bright 32-year-old financial analyst named Clara Hastings, looked up from her desk with wide eyes. She had worked with me for 6 years and knew the exact political layout of the firm. "Nathan, what happened?" she whispered, standing up as she saw the security guards behind me. "Brandon was boasting to the accounting team earlier that they were restructuring your equity pool." "Pack your personal things, Clara," I said quietly, stepping into my office. "By 5 o'clock tomorrow, this firm will be under severe liquidity pressure. If you want to keep your career clean, send your resume to my private email tonight. My personal investment firm will be opening a senior desk next month." Clara did not ask questions. She nodded, turned off her computer terminal, and began gathering her personal belongings. I opened my desk drawers, retrieved my personal hard drives containing 18 years of private deal logs, corporate correspondence, and charter documentation, and placed them into my leather briefcase. I left the company laptop, the corporate credit cards, and the office parking pass sitting neatly in the center of the desk. At 4:45 p.m., I handed my electronic building badge to the senior security guard. He looked uncomfortable, having known me for nearly 2 decades. "Sorry about this, Mr. Miller," the guard murmured. "No need to apologize, Frank." "You are doing your job," I replied, extending my hand to shake his. "Take care of yourself." I walked through the brass revolving doors of the building into the cold Manhattan evening air. Rain was falling heavy across Midtown. I walked 2 blocks down Lexington Avenue to a quiet coffee shop, sat at a corner table, and pulled out my personal encrypted smartphone. I opened my contacts and called Julian Reed, a senior partner at Reed & Sterling LLP and one of the sharpest banking and securities litigation attorneys in the tri-state area. Julian had handled institutional compliance for my private holding entity for over 12 years. "Julian," I said when he picked up on the second ring, "Brandon Thornton just executed a forced termination and attempted an unauthorized equity consolidation for the Zenith Logistics takeover." "Did they offer a waiver package?" Julian asked, his voice instantly dropping into formal legal assessment mode. "Yes, a $250,000 buyout check in exchange for an unconditional voting rights surrender. I explicitly refused, executed a formal handwritten proxy revocation on their master document, citing Delaware General Corporation Law 242 DB2, and left the building." Julian let out a low whistle over the line. "They tried to close a $350 million senior debt recapitalization without obtaining class voting approval from Vane Capital LLC. "Exactly," I confirmed, watching the rain streak down the coffee shop window. "Brandon thinks my Class B shares were wiped out by their board resolution last month. He doesn't realize that under the 2012 charter, Class B preferred stock requires an independent class vote that cannot be overridden by board consent or automatic powers of attorney." "What is the syndicate closing timeline?" Julian asked, the sound of keyboard keys rustling in the background. "The debt package closing is set for Monday morning at 9 o'clock a.m. at J.P. Morgan's headquarters on Park Avenue," I said. "Apex International is scheduling their public acquisition announcement for 10 o'clock a.m. The senior debt facility requires Thornton Holdings to warrant full equity authorization and clean title to all voting shares under Section 4.2 of the credit agreement. Section 4.2 carries a mandatory fraud covenant," Julian noted precisely. "If Thornton Holdings warrants clean voting title while an active statutory proxy revocation is on file, It triggers an immediate material breach under federal banking regulations. Precisely, I said, sipping my black coffee. I want you to prepare two formal legal notices tonight. Notice A goes to the lead debt syndicate manager at JP Morgan. Notice B goes to the chief legal officer of Apex International. Both notices must contain certified copies of the 2012 Zenith Logistics Charter, the Vein Capital share certificates, and my explicit proxy revocation served today. When do you want them served? Julian asked. Send them by certified courier and encrypted facsimile at exactly 8 a.m. on Monday morning, I instructed. 1 hour before their formal closing. Give Brandon and Gerald 72 hours of complete silence to celebrate their victory over the weekend. Consider it done, Nathan, Julian replied. This is going to be an extraordinary Monday. I hung up the phone, placed it back into my coat pocket, and walked out into the rain toward Grand Central Station to catch the evening train home to Connecticut. Over the weekend, Brandon Thornton threw a lavish celebration party at a private rooftop lounge in Soho. He invited the entire senior staff of Thornton Capital Partners, along with several high-net-worth institutional investors. According to an email Clara Hastings forwarded to my personal account on Saturday evening, Brandon openly boasted to attendees that he had successfully purged the firm of legacy senior management and saved $85 million in equity payouts that would now be redirected to the executive management incentive pool. Gerald Thornton remained on his yacht in the West Indies, sending out a firm-wide press release drafted by his public relations team announcing the impending $1.2 billion sale of Zenith Logistics to Apex International. The release highlighted Brandon's vision and structural financial leadership, framing the deal as a historic milestone for Thornton Capital Holdings. I spent my weekend quietly at my home in Fairfield, Connecticut. I spent Saturday morning working in my garden and Sunday reviewing the formal legal notices Julian Reed had drafted. Every statutory citation was airtight. Every exhibit, from the original 2012 Delaware corporate charter to the certified equity share registers of Vein Capital LLC, was bound and notarized. In corporate acquisitions, arrogant managers often mistake silence for surrender. When an experienced dealmaker does not threaten, sue immediately, or send angry emails, amateur executives assume they have won. They fail to understand that in high-stakes debt syndication, the most lethal legal maneuvers are executed in complete silence, right at the point of financial commitment. On Monday morning, October 13th, at 7:30 a.m., I sat in Julian Reed's office on the 44th floor of a building overlooking Park Avenue, holding a warm mug of black tea. Outside the window, Manhattan was waking up under a sharp, clear autumn sky. At 8 a.m. sharp, Julian's chief paralegal dispatched certified physical couriers and high-priority encrypted transmissions to two key locations. The first notice arrived at the desk of Arthur Vance, Senior Vice President of Institutional Debt Syndication at JP Morgan, located on the 32nd floor of their Park Avenue headquarters. Attached to the cover letter was a certified copy of the Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 242 notice, demonstrating that Thornton Holdings was attempting to execute a $350 million senior debt recapitalization without obtaining the mandatory class voting consent of Vein Capital LLC. The notice explicitly warned JP Morgan that releasing funds under Section 4.2 of the credit facility would constitute participating in a fraudulent charter execution under SEC Rule 10b-5, exposing the banking syndicate to joint legal liability and immediate statutory injunctions. The second notice arrived simultaneously at the desk of corporate counsel for Apex International, the acquiring tech conglomerate. The cover letter informed Apex's legal team that the equity structure of Zenith Logistics was subject to an active title dispute, and any merger agreement signed without Vein Capital's explicit consent was legally void under Delaware corporate law. At 8:15 a.m., Brandon Thornton arrived at JP Morgan's Park Avenue Executive Conference Room, accompanied by 6 outside attorneys, 2 junior analysts, and a photographer hired to document the signing ceremony. He wore a bespoke 3-piece navy suit, carrying leather-bound closing books containing 300 pages of acquisition documents. At 8:30 a.m., as Brandon was pouring himself coffee and greeting the bank's associate underwriters, the heavy oak doors of the conference room opened. Arthur Vance, J.P. Morgan's head of debt syndication, walked in accompanied by three senior bank compliance lawyers and the bank's chief risk officer. None of them were smiling. "Arthur," Brandon said cheerfully, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Great morning for a $1.2 billion closing. We have all these signature pages ready." Arthur Vance did not shake Brandon's hand. He laid a white binder containing Julian Reed's legal notices directly onto the center of the conference table. "Brandon, we have a catastrophic compliance emergency," Arthur Vance said, his voice cold and severe. 30 minutes ago, our legal desk was served with a certified notice from Vein Capital LLC. It contains a formal proxy revocation signed by Nathan Miller, explicitly withholding class voting consent for the senior debt facility under Delaware statutory law. Brandon laughed nervously, waving his hand in dismissive amusement. "Arthur, that is completely irrelevant. Nathan Miller was terminated on Thursday. He is an ex-employee. His stock options were canceled by board resolution. Our legal team handled his exit." Arthur Vance turned to Thornton Capital's lead outside attorney. "Is it true that Zenith Logistics has a separate Class B special preferred stock class issued under the 2012 Delaware Corporate Charter?" Thornton's lead attorney turned pale. He swallowed hard and looked down at his leather folder. He had only been hired 6 months prior by Brandon and had never bothered to audit the original 2012 founding charter documents stored in Delaware public records. We understood that all equity classes were converted to common shares during the 2018 corporate reorganization," the attorney stammered, his forehead glistening with sweat. "Understanding is not corporate law," Arthur Vance snapped. "Section 242 of Delaware law explicitly requires an independent class vote for charter amendments altering preferred rights. You represented in Section 4.2 of our credit agreement that Thornton Holdings possessed unencumbered, clean voting control to authorize this debt package. You lied to this syndicate." "We didn't lie," Brandon shouted, his face turning red as anger replaced his swagger. "Nathan Miller wrote some meaningless scribbles in the margin of a paper document. It's a cheap extortion tactic. Ignore it and release the $350 million loan. The main closing with Apex is in 20 minutes. At 8:45 a.m., the conference phone in the center of the table rang. Arthur Vance pressed the speaker button. The voice of Apex International's general counsel echoed clearly across the room. "Arthur, this is Apex Legal. We just reviewed a certified injunction warning from Reed and Sterling regarding Vein Capital's preferred veto rights over Zenith Logistics. We are halting all signature executions immediately. Until Thornton Holdings delivers certified clean equity title and an unconditional written consent from Nathan Miller, Apex is standing down from the transaction." The room fell into dead silence. The photographer hired by Brandon quietly lowered his camera and slid out the back door. Brandon stood frozen at the head of the table, his mouth open, staring at the conference phone as his $1.2 billion deal disintegrated before his eyes. By 10 o'clock a.m. on Monday, the panic inside Thornton Capital's Midtown headquarters was absolute. Word of the transaction collapse spread across Wall Street trading desks within minutes. When a $1.2 billion M&A deal freezes 15 minutes before closing due to debt covenant fraud, financial markets notice immediately. The financial consequences for Thornton Holdings were instantaneous and catastrophic. To prepare Zenith Logistics for the Apex takeover, Brandon had executed a series of aggressive bridge financing transactions over the preceding 6 months. He had drawn down $45 million in short-term credit lines from a secondary lender syndicate, backed by a mandatory cross-default clause linked directly to the J.P. Morgan senior facility, when J.P. Morgan formally canceled the senior credit agreement at 9:15 a.m. due to material misrepresentation under Section 4.2. It automatically triggered Clause 9b of the bridge financing contract. The secondary lenders issued an immediate debt acceleration notice, demanding full repayment of $45 million cash within 48 hours. Thornton Holdings did not have $45 million in liquid cash. Virtually all of their working capital had been locked into non-refundable transaction fees, legal retainers, and bridge loan prepayments. By 11 o'clock a.m., the firm was facing immediate corporate insolvency and systemic default. At 11:30 a.m., my phone began ringing. I sat quietly in Julian Reed's office, sipping cold, sparkling water and reading financial market coverage of the Zenith deal stall. Brandon Thornton's caller ID flashed on my smartphone screen. I did not answer. He called 4 times in 10 minutes, followed by 5 frantic text messages. "Nathan, pick up the phone immediately. We need to resolve this technical misunderstanding right now." "Nathan, Gerald is calling an emergency board meeting. You are legally required to respond to corporate communications asks." "Nathan, we are willing to offer you $2 million to clear this proxy issue today." I left every call unanswered and every text unread. By 1 o'clock p.m., Gerald Thornton was on a private jet flying from Nassau back to New York. The founder, who had spent 6 months lounging on a yacht in St. Barthélemy, was now returning to a firm teetering on the edge of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At 2 o'clock p.m., my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Gerald Thornton's direct personal line. I picked up on the third ring. "Nathan." Gerald's voice came through the line. Completely stripped of his earlier smooth arrogance, his tone was strained, breathless, and heavy with desperation. "I am on a plane heading into Teterboro. What in God's name are you doing?" "Hello, Gerald," I replied calmly. "I am enjoying a quiet afternoon in Manhattan." "Nathan, this is madness," Gerald shouted over the engine hum of his private jet. "J.P. Morgan froze the senior debt facility. Apex pulled their closing offer. The bridge lenders just issued a $45 million default demand. You are destroying the company we built together over 18 years. "Correction, Gerald," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "I spent 18 years building Zenith Logistics into a $250 million EBITDA engine. You and your nephew spent 6 months attempting to steal my $85 million equity stake using an illegal dilution waiver and a security escort." "Brandon made a mistake," Gerald pleaded, abandoning all executive dignity. "He was overzealous. He didn't understand the 2012 charter structure. I will fire Brandon today. I will publicly reinstate your title as Senior Managing Director. Just call J.P. Morgan and withdraw the proxy revocation notice." "Reinstating my title is useless, Gerald," I said evenly. "Brandon did not act alone. He acted with your explicit blessing over a video screen on Thursday afternoon. You told me to take a $250,000 check and ruin 18 years of goodwill. Now the statutory legal reality of Delaware corporate law is taking its course. What do you want, Nathan?" Gerald begged, his voice cracking. "Tell me what you want. We will pay you $10 million cash right now to release the Class B Veto." I let a long, heavy silence linger on the line before answering. $10 million does not cover $85 million in rightful equity, Gerald," I said clearly. "Nor does it cover the damage your nephew inflicted on my professional reputation. If Thornton Holdings wants to avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Wednesday morning, you and Brandon will attend a formal restructuring meeting at Reed and Sterling's offices tomorrow at 9 o'clock a.m. "We will be there," Gerald agreed instantly. 9 a.m. "Please, Nathan, do not take any further legal action until we meet. My terms are non-negotiable," I added, "and Gerald, bring your outside legal counsel. You are going to need them to draft the handover documents." I hung up the phone without waiting for his response. Julian Reed looked over from across his desk, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "They are completely broken, aren't they?" "They built an empire on leverage and arrogance, Julian," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "When you pull the legal foundation out from underneath a house of cards, it doesn't just fall, it pulverizes." That evening, I dined quietly with Clara Hastings at a steakhouse near Grand Central. I offered her the position of Vice President of Operations at my newly registered private equity firm, Vane Asset Management LLC, with a 50% salary increase and guaranteed equity vesting. She accepted on the spot. As we toasted to the future, I checked my financial terminal. The news headlines were already reporting the collapse of Thornton Holdings' credit profile. The trap was set, the leverage had swung completely, and tomorrow morning would bring the final buyout at 8:45 a.m. on Tuesday. October 14th, Gerald Thornton and Brandon Thornton entered the conference room at Reed and Sterling. Gerald looked 10 years older than he had on the video screen 5 days earlier. His eyes were bloodshot, his designer suit was wrinkled from his overnight flight, and his posture was completely defeated. Brandon walked behind him like a ghost, his former arrogance completely crushed, staring blankly at the floor. They were accompanied by their lead outside counsel, who sat down with a stack of financial disclosures that showed Thornton Holdings was less than 24 hours away from total financial collapse. Julian Reed and I sat on the opposite side of the long glass table. We did not offer coffee, small talk, or polite introductions. "Let's get straight to the numbers," Gerald murmured, leaning his forearms on the table. "Nathan, we have spent the night auditing our treasury. If we don't clear the bridge debt default by 4 o'clock today, the lenders will file for involuntary Chapter 11 liquidation. Thornton Holdings will be wiped out. Apex will walk away forever." He looked at me with hollow, desperate eyes. "What is your price to sign the Class B consent?" I opened a black leather folio and pulled out 3 copies of a binding corporate restructuring agreement drafted by Julian Reed overnight. I slid 1 copy to Gerald, 1 to Brandon, and 1 to their attorney. "These terms are non-negotiable," I stated firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You will accept them in full by 10 o'clock a.m., or we walk out and let the debt syndicate file their liquidation petitions at noon." Gerald's attorney quickly put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. As his eyes moved down the terms, his expression turned from anxiety to sheer disbelief. "Item 1, I outlined clearly. Vein Capital LLC will convert its Class B special preferred shares into senior controlling voting equity in Zenith Logistics. Apex International has already agreed in principle to resume acquisition negotiations directly with Vein Capital LLC under a revised transaction framework. Item 2, I continued. Thornton Holdings will execute an immediate lump sum payout of $85 million to Vein Capital LLC, representing my full equity valuation under the original 2012 charter agreement. This payment will be funded directly from the initial escrow draw of the restructured deal." Brandon let out a quiet, strangled gasp, but Gerald raised a trembling hand to silence his nephew. "Item 3, I said, eyeing Brandon directly. "Brandon Thornton will be terminated from Thornton Capital Partners immediately for cause, based on gross breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law. He will receive 0 severance, his unvested stock allocations will be canceled, and the firm will execute a full clawback of his executive bonuses from the past 2 fiscal years." Brandon jumped out of his chair, his face turning pale with rage. "You can't do that. That's my entire net worth, Uncle Gerald. You can't let him ruin my career. Sit down, Brandon." Gerald snapped with sudden, fierce venom, slamming his hand onto the table. "You brought this catastrophe onto this firm with your pathetic greed. Sit down and shut your mouth." Brandon sank back into his chair, trembling, unable to look anyone in the eye. "Item 4, I concluded coldly. "Gerald Thornton will tender his immediate resignation as Executive Chairman and CEO of Thornton Capital Partners. You will retire permanently from all corporate directorships and assign your voting proxies to an independent board committee chaired by Julian Reed." The conference room fell into complete silence. Gerald stared at the document for nearly 2 minutes. He knew as well as I did that these terms stripped him of his executive kingdom and destroyed his nephew's corporate future. But he also knew that the alternative was total bankruptcy, public disgrace, and personal liability lawsuits from institutional investors. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his gold fountain pen, and looked up at me one last time. 18 years, Nathan," Gerald whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was teaching you how to play corporate chess." "You taught me well, Gerald," I replied without a trace of sarcasm. "You taught me that in corporate transactions, whoever controls the structural covenants controls the board. You just forgot to check your own charter." At 9:45 a.m., Gerald Thornton signed all 3 copies of the restructuring agreement. Brandon was forced to sign his resignation and bonus clawback documents under the watchful eyes of 3 notary publics. By 11 o'clock a.m., Julian Reed delivered the executed consent agreements to J.P. Morgan and Apex International. The senior debt facility was unfrozen, the bridge loan default was cleared, and the restructured $1.2 billion acquisition of Zenith Logistics was officially signed. At 2 p.m., the electronic funds transfer cleared. $85 million was deposited directly into the private account of Vein Capital LLC. 3 weeks later, I stood in the top-floor executive suite of a brand-new office building overlooking Bryant Park in Manhattan. The polished brass sign at the glass entrance read Vein Asset Management LLC. Clara Hastings walked into my office holding a fresh stack of portfolio acquisition targets. "Nathan," she said with a bright smile, "the board of directors for the new Zenith entity just confirmed your appointment as chairman of the advisory board. Also, Brandon Thornton's legal team called, attempting to negotiate his bonus clawback. Tell his legal team that Vein Asset Management does not negotiate with defaulted executives," I said calmly, taking a sip of my morning espresso. "Send their files straight to outside litigation." "Right away, Chairman," Claire replied, stepping out and closing the frosted glass door behind her. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the Manhattan skyline below. The city was moving, fast and unyielding as always. In the world of high-stakes corporate mergers, men like Gerald and Brandon Thornton believed that power was built on arrogance, titles, and intimidation. They learned too late that real power sits quietly in the fine print of a well-drafted legal covenant, waiting for the exact moment to strike. I closed my leather portfolio, sat down at my desk, and began structuring our next corporate acquisition.